Welcome to Jargon, a podcast bringing clarity to commonly misunderstood business concepts. We're debunking and simplifying the buzzwords and ideas plaguing today's business world and offering a fresh perspective on these topics.
Hello and welcome to our Trilogy Jargon podcast. This is Bill Ivedy, and we have a special guest here today, Alex Perry. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Bill.
Alex is a senior consultant with our team here, and Alex just published an article about... Actually, why don't you tell me about the article? Me explaining it, then you explaining it back to me. That's kind of silly.
Sure. So the article that I posted was, when is change and change management too much for a company? The goal and the thought process behind this was that sometimes you see when startup companies are acquired by another company, maybe, or private equity, and they're trying to grow really quickly, leadership can have a vision of the growth that they're wanting, and it might not be exactly aligned with the company and their capacity at that time.
Okay, so really what you're talking about here is, knowing whether your organization's really ready for change. So if you're a startup company, or maybe you're a company that's been around a while and you're having to pivot into maybe with a private equity firm, or maybe even trying to go public, or those type of things. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Exactly, yes. Or even just implementing new systems to help streamline different areas. Maybe that area or your department at a certain company might not be fully established yet, and you have your eyes set on a new system that will help everything be better in the end, but you have to make sure that that department or maybe that area has the baseline needed to make that project successful.
So what are some of the things that, someone listening here might ask themselves as they start looking at, maybe they have a change coming up with an acquisition, or the change with new systems, or just going public, or whatever it might be? What are some questions that they need to ask, maybe just themselves introspectively, to make sure they're ready for it?
I think the number one thing would be, do we have the people and the resources available for this? You can implement all the systems in the world, but if you don't have the people there to make them successful, they're not going to be successful and help you how you think that they should.
Tell me, you're just talking about the people and that type of thing. What are some things that you kind of need to look out for and think about?
I would say champions of the project are always very, very beneficial, but also, do people have the time and resources to dedicate to that project? Because essentially we need the decision makers on the business side to help us make the decisions and move the project along, as well as people who will be championing this project for the company and for our team.
Okay, so for example, if you're putting in a new business system or you're going through an acquisition, people need to be available to help with that. And I think what we see with companies that are middle market type companies or fast growing companies, they typically don't have a lot of extra people sitting around with capacity. And larger organizations, they might have some people with some capacity that they can put on something. So they really got to look at that. So what do companies need to do to address that?
I would say just making sure your SMEs, your subject matter experts, have the support that they need prior to starting a project. So if they need an assistant or need a larger team to help them with maybe their day-to-day tasks while they can focus their time and effort on the project, that would be one way to approach it.
Backfilling is what you're getting at. So maybe bringing in some temporary workers to backfill for what they were doing so that they can focus on helping the organization go through that change.
Right.
Okay. So then you started talking about business processes. So what do you mean by that?
What I've experienced sometimes is that people wear a lot of hats in, like you said, the mid-size or smaller companies. And so when you go into a department or an area and you have your subject matter experts that are doing a lot of different things, they don't have, it's hard to implement a system into an environment like that if there aren't these standard processes and they're not defined and people don't know their roles and responsibilities. And if they're doing a bunch of different things, it can kind of muddy the waters. And so I think that is first and foremost the most important thing to do before you start a project, is just aligning everything, making sure the processes are defined, roles and responsibilities are there, and people know what they're supposed to be doing.
Okay, so when I think of the mid-sized companies, you might have someone whose job is accounting manager, but they also do something that's related to procurement or HR or payroll or something that may extend beyond what they do. Or maybe they get involved in treasury activities, but they're the accounting manager. So what I've seen, and tell me if you've seen this, where they say, oh, you're the accounting manager, we're going to assume that's all you do, but they forgot about all the 50 other things that individual does.
Yes.
And then the other big issue that companies probably face too is, I've got a expert who does a lot of these things, and usually the people that are the most productive people, they take on more work, and there's more that they do that people realize.
Right. Exactly.
So really making sure you've got roles, responsibilities aligned up and who's responsible for what. Does that have a lot to do with decision making too, do you think?
I think it does, because if people know if they know their roles and responsibilities, and they know the areas that they can make decisions in, and what they can own, essentially.
Okay, so for example, if you're going through an acquisition and you're trying to decide which process do we adopt, and one person's got to decide that. So let's say it's an accounting practice of how we're going to book, something simple as booking depreciation and what our policy is going to be for that. You need one person, not two people deciding that, because then you get two different answers.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, and then, but isn't it also being able to make those decisions and sticking with them?
Yes,
too?
yes. Being able to, stick with your decision is very important, because you don't want to make a decision and 2 months later go back on the decision, because so much progress has been made to work towards maybe decision A versus decision B. And that if you start going back on your decisions, that's just going to cause confusion amongst the project team and implementers, and it has a downstream effect. Okay,
so part of the challenge is if people second guess their decisions they've made and they go back and change just because they didn't know, maybe that wasn't their primary responsibility, it was a secondary responsibility, but they still made that decision. Somebody else comes in and realizes, well, maybe that wasn't quite the right way to go, and they've got to backtrack. So tell me about, when we think about change, what we see a lot of is, for example, a while back we did some work with a company that was acquiring another company, and they had basically a 3-month target to basically transition off the old company's processes and systems into the new ones. And so basically like 3 months. So setting those targets, how do you deal with that? And when you got targets that are just super aggressive, particularly like with an acquisition or something?
Yeah, that is difficult. And a lot of the times you have the client that's wanting, or you have companies that are wanting a quicker timeline, a quicker target, because they want to get things done faster, start using the new systems, whereas maybe your system integrators are pushing back because they know that the capacity on their end might not be able to match that really fast-paced timeline. But I think it's completely doable if you do have the resources available to dedicate to projects and just, put your heads together and get this project done in a shorter amount of time. I think it can be done, but you have to have the resources available to do it.
And so you're referring to a system implementation. So maybe what you do is you decide that you redefine what transition means. So maybe your first, let's say, transition with an integration, maybe merger, you say, okay, we're not going to do everything. We're only going to do a part of these things so we can move forward.
Yep.
And don't try to do everything at once and break it up into smaller pieces. So maybe the first phase is getting everybody lined up on the same accounting system. And then the later phase is putting the operational systems and combining those later.
Exactly. And if people aren't used to, say, this accounting system, and it's going to take some getting used to for your employees to learn this new system, adjust to the change, and then you can move on to maybe this second system or third system to help enhance the whole entire environment. But it might not be the best idea to try to implement 3 systems at one time.
Okay, so there's that knowledge that you have to have. So if you're transitioning to new systems and new processes, the people in the organization need to know what they are.
Yep.
For example, if I'm thinking about policies and procedures, do I need to get those rolled out before or after put new systems in? What do you see work out the best?
I see policies and procedures kind of happening alongside the systems and sort of finalizing them towards the end of the project. Once we have our defined roles and responsibilities in the system, we know what people are doing, they've been trained on the system, and then we can sort of take that information and create these policies and procedures that help define that. Ideally, I think it would be helpful if that was established beforehand, but it sort of depends on how much you're having to define these processes as you go.
Okay, so if I think about the training aspect of this, where does that come into play on these change efforts? And how do you get, you got people working on stuff and trying to learn everything, but at the same time, they got work to do. How do you find time for training?
You have to schedule one-on-one trainings, and you have to get them in the system. I think it's not everyone's number one priority, but it has to be done. And I think what I've seen in previous companies is you get to the end and maybe you set up at one-on-one trainings and people either miss them, they have other things they want to do, they don't join your meeting, and then they come to us with questions, and they're questions that could have been easily fixed with these one-on-one trainings. And so I know it's not everyone's number one priority, but and even if it's a group training or watching videos or looking at our training guides, there's different ways to train people, but making sure you're doing that well in advance of your go live is very critical.
So you said something, one-on-one training. You've said that a couple times. So are you basically suggesting that that's better than trying to do like mass training, classroom type stuff?
In my experience, yes, because people get embarrassed or shy, or they
not asking questions
because they think it might be a dumb question, and
or they're doing something else.
Yes, exactly.
And they think, oh, I'm in this big group of people,
and we're all on Zoom or Teams, and they don't know what I'm doing. I'm just kind of working on my emails. Yeah.
Okay, so really, it's getting that one-on-one time where someone can ask those questions that are relevant to them. And then, by the way, they're not listening to somebody else ask questions that aren't relative to them or they don't have questions about.
And we often have them drive, so they have to share their screen. They have to actually log into the system. Maybe they have to be the ones doing it, so they don't just... It's one thing to see someone do something and absorb it. It's another thing to actually do it yourself.
Yeah. So really eyeball to eyeball time with them. So what have you seen work well in organizations, especially mid-market companies, in terms of being prepared and some practices they put in place that worked well?
Really during right before go live, when it's sort of, we call it the UAT phase, really having the clients and the employees being hands-on at that stage really helps.
Okay, you said UAT, so you're using some jargon here. And we're not allowed to use jargon on our podcast, or we got to define what it is when we do, because we're just as bad as any other consultant in terms of using jargon. So what's UAT?
UAT stands for User Acceptance Testing.
Okay, so that's basically if I've got a new system and I've got to make sure the people accept it before they go live. Because, you just don't want to give somebody a accounts payable person a new system and say, oh, by the way, here it is. And they go, wait a minute, it doesn't work.
And with that process, if they're involved in, I wouldn't call it the decision-making process, but if they're involved in the vision for the system throughout the process and they're, your requirements gathering, you go to those people and you say, what are your pain points? What does this need to do? And then you had them involved in the user acceptance testing phases. Then when it comes time for go live, they're going to feel like they were part of this implementation and that maybe their feedback was heard and that they were trained properly, and then adoption will be a whole lot easier.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Now, because you mentioned user acceptance testing right before go live, what about when there's problems and you have a deadline? And what do you do about that? How do you handle those things? Let's say the system doesn't do exactly what they want it to do.
They might have to maybe even workarounds in the system. If there's anything the system integrators need to change or add, it's better to know about those things earlier on than come go live. And so having those people involved in testing is very important throughout the process.
Yeah, and so I'm thinking maybe there's some earlier testing they need to do before that. But are there times when we just have to say, look, you're going to have to do, you mentioned workarounds. Look, we're not going to be able to do all this at once because we got a deadline and we got to meet it. So let's put those kind of on the back burner and address those later. Sort of what I was alluding to earlier, trying to take small steps, little at a time. Don't try to boil the ocean and try to get everything done at once. And putting that strain on the organization. I think about if I'm changing processes and I'm changing the back office and I'm changing operations at the same time, there's kind of a push and pull. And so sometimes it's let's change the back office first and then hit operations, or vice versa. So let's say I'm an accounts payable clerk or I'm an accountant and I know there's going to be a bunch of change coming up. What advice do you have for them as employees of a company who know change is coming? What type of things do they need to do, and what can they do if you're in their shoes?
I would say attend every training opportunity you're given, but also ask questions and try to learn how to do. I know you're used to doing your job as maybe a certain way, but try to learn the new way of doing things that might not be fun at the beginning, but putting in the effort to learn how to do it and figuring out maybe the new system, or like figuring out how to utilize our training guides to make your job easier. I think if you adopt it while you have the resources available, it'll be a lot easier than when the resources roll off.
Okay, so be curious, ask questions. If you're not sure about something,
get involved.
Yeah, get involved. Don't be afraid to step in and, like you see a meeting going on and they're talking about it. Don't be afraid to step in and ask and learn. Would you also say it's helpful for them to learn what other people are doing and other departments are doing too?
I do. I don't think it could hurt at all.
Yeah, and it might take a little extra time, but that time invested will make that individual more valuable. We've got people out there you've seen really step up and be, I'll call it super users. What are some other things that they're doing to be good super users and champion that change?
they are forward thinking, and they're thinking, how can we use this system that we're implementing today to change our processes and make them maybe more efficient in the future, or like, here's an area of growth or opportunity with this system. We might not use this system for this specific thing for our first go live, but maybe in a couple months or a year we can reassess and we can expand maybe the scope of the system to include XYZ to make things easier for everybody. I think that's really important, to have those people that are forward thinking and helping think, okay, how can we make the business more efficient?
So thinking more broadly, I would probably also add to that being positive.
For
Being
sure.
a positive influence. You might see something that isn't perfect, and not everything's perfect, but accepting that. But really, I guess what you're getting at is look at the bigger picture of things. I think the other thing that happens in these change efforts is the individual person may not see the immediate benefits for them. The benefits typically are for the greater good of the company as opposed to each individual person. And a lot of times they look at that change as something, any change is,
against them.
Yeah, it's not helping, and it makes things worse, and they don't look at the benefits of those changes. And the other thing I've seen organizations do too is ask people, what's your biggest pain point? And let's try to solve your pain point while we're going to change everything else alongside that. So really helping give and take.
Yep.
Don't always say, I want you to change all this, but what are some pain points we can solve for you specifically? Right. Alex, I know you've worked with a lot of our clients on basically making change and helping them adopt. You've done extremely well with our clients with that. And any other bits of advice for any of our listeners out here?
I don't think so. I think the article covers a lot of it, and hopefully this podcast gives a little bit of a glimpse into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're on Trinigy's website, you can look up Alex's name on there. Just do a search Alex on our website. Her article will pop up. There's really some good points in here as you guys think about whether you're an executive or whether you're someone who's maybe a project manager or someone who has been asked to be a change champion. Some good advice and tips in there. Well, thank you, Alex. Thanks for joining us
you, Bill.
on our podcast.
Of course.